All right, I think we're gonna get started here. Hopefully we'll have a couple more people coming in as we reintroduce ourselves. But again, I want to thank everyone for coming to day 2 of the Wetlands webinar series. This is a good opportunity to, again, introduce yourself in the chat box and also to make sure that your name is updated for attendance purposes for this program. I just want to, before we get kind of into the content we're going to go over today, I just want to bring your attention back to that intention that you made yesterday as far as, what you want to get out of this course, about, just the values that you bring to this before we get started. All right, let's see if I can advance my slides. All right. So for yesterday, we went over the kind of, Gretchen talked about the values that wetlands have, talked about some specific instances of wetlands in the Hudson Valley region. And then I talked a little bit about threats and some of the basic ways that we can address these threats. Today we're going to get a little bit more in depth. Gretchen's going to start us off by talking about some of the regulatory protections for wetlands. And then both Ingrid and Gretchen are going to go into some tools and methods for predicting the occurrence of wetlands on the landscape. And then finally, we're going to end by preparing for and conducting a site visit, and that'll involve some kind of hands-on use of the maps that Gretchen had shared with you all in predicting the occurrence of wetlands on the landscape. We'll mention this again a little bit later, but I just want everyone to keep in mind that your homework for tonight is going to be to look up the wetland protections in your community and also to watch the virtual field trip. And we will supply links to these at the end or during this workshop, but just keep that in mind before we get started. All right. So I want to thank everyone for submitting all of their fantastic photos. We're just going to move a little bit quick through these, but it's really been great to see the diversity of wetlands that you all encounter on a daily basis out there in the field. I did want to go over what people had identified as issues that they wanted to address in a little bit more detail. So here, the major concern that people had that they identified in the breakout room session was local wetland law creation and the enforcement of those laws. And so that is definitely something that we're going to be addressing. We'll be doing that a little bit more in session 3, but I'm glad to see all the interest in this topic. Also, how to educate community landowners, community and landowners about wetlands, their values and protections, and hopefully this workshop will be helpful in that as well. We also looked at, we heard concerns about the influx of people due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is definitely a concern, for many conservation professionals and communities. Many people were interested on more information on the ecology and the values of wetlands, how to recognize and identify wetlands in the field, and using maps. So we'll definitely go over some of that today, and the virtual field trip will be a great way to look into that a little bit more. Understanding state and federal wetlands law and jurisdiction. We'll definitely be going over that. Using local plans, especially comprehensive plans to address the protection of wetlands, stewardship, and vernal pool conservation. So a variety of topics, but I'm sure we will be able to get to a lot of these. And especially make sure to hold some of your questions for the end. And if you're able to be here for the 4:30 to 5 discussion at the end, we can definitely go over some more specifics there. All right, so that was my slideshow and everything I had to say at this point. So from here, I'm going to pass the ball on to Gretchen, and she's going to be explaining about federal regulatory protections for wetlands and the state protections. So take it away, Gretchen. All right. Yeah, looks like you're unmuted now, Gretchen.
Okay. I'm sorry, I have to find my file. No. Can you see that?
No.
Can see it now, Gretchen.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I couldn't find my file. So in this session, we're going to talk about existing regulatory protections for wetlands at the federal and state levels, and also how to find all the wetlands that do not appear on public maps. And we'll give you some practice at that. We'll talk a little about preparing for and conducting an effective site visit. And at the end, we'll tell you a little more about the homework. So now to the federal and state wetland regulatory programs. The federal authority for protecting streams and wetlands comes from the 1972 Clean Water Act, which provides some protections to what are referred to as waters of the United States, or WOTUS. Waters of the United States are defined in Section 404 of the Clean Water Act as so-called navigable waters. And at the time, the justification for protecting these waters was for the commercial interests in navigation. Protection of wetlands and streams under the Clean Water Act is mainly administered by the Army Corps of Engineers, sometimes in consultation with the US EPA and the US Fish and Wildlife Service. Over these many decades, there has been much controversy over the limits of what should be considered navigable waters and WOTUS, and thus which streams and wetlands deserve protection under the Clean Water Act. I won't go into all the arguments, but in general, development interests, lobbyists for farmers and ranchers and property rights advocates have long pushed for a narrow interpretation that is encompassing fewer parts of the landscape. And environmentalists have advocated for a broad interpretation of WOTUS, encompassing more wetlands and more streams. There have been many different administrative interpretations of waters of the United States over the years, and many lawsuits challenging the Army Corps' jurisdictional determinations. Some pivotal cases have even reached the US Supreme Court. In an attempt to clarify the extent of federal jurisdiction over wetlands and streams, the EPA issued what they called the Clean Water Rule in 2015, which said that waters of the United States include perennial, intermittent, and ephemeral streams and bordering, contiguous, and neighboring wetlands, which are all specifically defined in the rule. In 2016, the Trump administration challenged that Clean Water Rule, and now in 2020, the administration has replaced it with what is called the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. Under this rule, Waters of the United States include perennial waters that are, quote, navigable, unquote, and I'll explain that. Perennial and intermittent tributaries to those navigable waters, and quote, adjacent wetlands, unquote. Certain activities in those waters are regulated under the Clean Water Act. At the federal level, there is no universal requirement for setbacks or buffer zones around wetlands or along streams, but those can be imposed on a case-by-case basis at the discretion of the Army Corps of Engineers. The term traditional navigable waters is used here and there in the 2020 rule and is defined by the EPA and the Army Corps as all waters which are currently used or were used in the past or may be susceptible to use in interstate or foreign commerce, including all waters which are subject to the ebb and flow of the tide. This is taken to mean perennially flowing streams and rivers that have been used or could be used for commercial navigation. Federal jurisdiction over activities in wetlands is based entirely on their ultimate connection to navigable streams and rivers. So you need to understand these three terms that relate to the permanency or temporariness of stream flow, because these terms come up in various places in the regulations and in the policies of the federal agencies. A perennial stream is one where surface water flows continuously year-round in a year of typical precipitation. An intermittent stream is one where the surface water flows continuously during certain times of a typical year, but not merely in direct response to precipitation. And an ephemeral stream flows only briefly in direct response to precipitation or snowmelt. The so-called adjacent wetlands in the 2020 rule are those that abut a traditional navigable water, or TNW, or tributary, or a tributary to a traditional navigable water. Those that are inundated by flooding from a TNW or a tributary in a typical year. Those that are physically separated from a TNW or tributary only by a natural berm, bank, dune, or similar natural feature, or are physically separated from a TNW or tributary only by an artificial structure, but still maintain a direct hydrologic surface connection between the wetlands in a typical year. An example of this last situation is where a road divides a wetland, but the two parts of the wetland are still hydrologically connected by a culvert under the road. Now excluded under the current rule are isolated wetlands and ponds, that is, they have no stream connections, ephemeral streams, and what are called prior converted croplands, which are areas that are now cropland only because they were drained before, I forget the year, I meant to look it up, it might be 1985 or so. The 2020 rule removes protections from ephemeral streams, and these account for more than 18% of the waterways nationwide. And also removes protections for wetlands without surface water connections or to intermittent or perennial streams, and these account for about 51% of the wetlands nationwide. There is no minimum size for federal jurisdictional wetlands. A wetland the size of your bedroom could qualify. This is an important distinction from the New York State program, which I'll describe in a couple of minutes. So how are activities regulated under the Clean Water Act? To reduce the bureaucratic burden on both the Corps of Engineers and on applicants, the Corps has long used the device of the nationwide permit for projects whose size and expected environmental impacts fall below certain thresholds. These permits allow certain projects to proceed with minimal red tape even if there are some adverse impacts to wetlands and streams. Projects expected to have more significant impacts to wetlands and streams must obtain what's called a nationwide permit, requiring a much more lengthy review process. Nationwide permits are used very widely. Here's an example of one which is often invoked for projects that come before municipal agencies for approval. NWP 29, as it's called, applies to residential developments. It allows for filling of non-tidal wetlands or streams for construction of residential buildings and residential subdivisions, but only if the fill disrupts no more than 1/2 acre of non-tidal wetlands and no more than 300 linear feet of stream bed without an individual permit. The applicant must submit a pre-construction notification to the Army Corps of Engineers. There is no regulated buffer zone imposed automatically, but it can be required if the Corps deems it necessary. The pre-construction notification sometimes triggers a visit by Army Corps staff to determine the extent of jurisdiction and of the impacts to the resource, but the permit is often then certified by a simple letter from the Corps, since this is much preferable to the sometimes years-long process of obtaining an individual permit. Many developers and applicants try to design their projects so that impacts to wetlands and streams fall within the limits of nationwide permits. There are many more such nationwide permits for different kinds of projects. All are intended to allow projects affecting wetlands and streams to proceed without a long permit review process. So, is there a map of the federal jurisdictional wetlands? The answer is no. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has made a map series called the National Wetland Inventory Maps, but the maps are not really related to jurisdiction. Although many of the wetlands shown on these maps are under federal jurisdiction, the maps also show many that are not, and the maps omit many wetlands that are under federal jurisdiction. In addition, the extent and boundaries of the wetlands shown on these maps are quite inaccurate and should never be relied on to depict the actual extent of jurisdiction. The Corps of Engineers understands this and does not use the NWI maps for determining the wetlands that they regulate. Instead, wherever activities might be encroaching on a jurisdictional wetland, the Corps requires that wetlands be delineated on the ground and surveyed onto site maps. But anyway, these maps are a good first step for finding wetlands in the landscape. And in a few minutes, Ingrid will show you how to find these and lots of other maps online. And we'll also show you how to find all the other wetlands that are not on these maps. Now to the New York State program. The New York State Freshwater Wetlands Act of 1975 identifies wetlands on the basis of vegetation. But the state uses field criteria, hydric soils, wetland hydrology, and hydrophytic vegetation very similar to those of the federal government to identify and delineate wetlands. The Freshwater Wetlands Act offers certain protections to wetlands that are 12.4 acres or larger, that's equivalent to 5 hectares, and to certain smaller wetlands that are of, quote, unusual local importance. Those smaller wetlands are usually ones that are associated with public drinking water supplies or that are known to support a rare animal species. Activities in a 100-foot wide adjacent area around each jurisdictional wetland are also regulated. Because the state regulates mainly only the very large wetlands and a few smaller ones, it turns out that activities in only approximately 6% of the wetlands in the state are regulated under the State Freshwater Wetlands Act. What kinds of activities are regulated in these wetlands? A permit is required for draining and dredging or excavation in wetlands, for filling or grading, for erecting structures or building roads or septic systems or bulkheads or dikes or dams, for polluting, and that includes use of pesticides, but lots of other forms of pollution, and any other activity that substantially impairs wetland functions or benefits. There are some exemptions for agriculture and for logging. Different from the federal program, the DEC is required to map all the wetlands regulated by the Act. Any wetland that does not appear on the New York State freshwater wetland maps is not considered jurisdictional by the state of New York. The DEC recognizes, however, that some wetlands that meet the Article 24 definition do not appear on the maps. The maps are occasionally updated, but that is a long and complicated process, including notifications of all adjacent landowners and public hearings, and it usually takes years to complete those updates for the maps. The DEC also recognizes that the maps are very inaccurate in terms of the wetland boundaries, and for that reason they do not rely on the maps to determine the actual spatial extent of jurisdictional wetlands, but instead require, like the Corps of Engineers requires, that where a new activity might encroach on a jurisdictional wetland, the wetland boundary be delineated on the ground according to field observations of vegetation and, where needed, soils and indicators of wetland hydrology. I should mention that somewhat different regulations apply to lands within the watersheds of the New York City reservoirs. In the Catskill region and the Croton watershed region, the two areas shown in green on this map, the New York City Department of Environmental Protection, or DEP, has their own set of restrictions for activities in and near jurisdictional wetlands and streams. And because many wetlands in the New York City reservoir watersheds that are smaller than 12.4 acres are connected by streams to the reservoirs, they are considered to be of unusual local importance under the law, so are considered to be jurisdictional. So in those watershed areas, you'll find many of the small wetlands do show up on the maps. So the state and federal laws and the New York City watershed regulations have many, leave many small and isolated wetlands entirely unprotected. But local legislation can fill in the gap and can also impose buffer zone requirements for all jurisdictional wetlands and streams. We'll talk more about the possibilities for local legislation tomorrow. I think we have time for a few questions before we go on to talking about how to find wetlands from various kinds of resources.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much, Gretchen. I encourage folks to either post their questions in the chat box or to raise your hand, and I should be able to call on you and unmute you. It looks like we have one question about the protections to vernal pools, I guess at the state and federal level.
Mm-hmm. For the most part, vernal pools are unprotected at the state level. The exceptions would be if a vernal pool is known to support a state-listed threatened or endangered animal species. But in most cases, most vernal pools have not been surveyed for rare species, and so we don't know where they are. And most vernal pools do not appear on the freshwater wetland maps, so they are not protected. Most vernal pools are unprotected also at the federal level. Vernal pools, by definition, are substantially unconnected to streams. Now, a few are connected by ephemeral streams or possibly intermittent streams, and those would be, or at least the ones connected by intermittent streams would be or could come under the federal regulations. Those connected only by ephemeral streams or those entirely isolated would not be regulated under the federal program.
Great, thank you, Gretchen. We have another question here saying, when you said that only 6% of New York State wetlands are regulated by the state, is that by area or by the number of wetlands themselves?
That is a very good question that I meant to look up before this webinar. I'm sorry I can't, but I will make a note to look that up and get back to you. Nate, do you know whose question that was?
Yes, that was Jennifer Phillips.
Okay, I'll get back to Jennifer. I'll get back to everyone, actually, if I can find the answer later today or tomorrow.
Great. All right, we have another question. What's the difference between freshwater wetlands and the National Wetlands Inventory in the Ulster County Parcel Viewer?
The National Wetland Inventory wetland maps are the ones made by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Those show many more wetlands in the landscape, including lots of small wetlands, although they miss lots of small wetlands and other wetlands too. The New York State freshwater wetland maps are the ones showing mainly the large wetlands, the wetlands of 12.4 acres and larger, and just a few smaller ones if they are of, quote, unusual local importance. So the New York State freshwater wetland maps show the wetlands that fall under the state jurisdiction. The National Wetland Inventory maps are not especially related to, to federal jurisdiction, although many but not all of the federally regulated wetlands are on those maps. Those maps also show a number of wetlands that are not under federal jurisdiction, so it will be a bit confusing. But does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that would get at his point there. All right, well, it looks like, does anyone have one last question? We maybe have some time for one more question. But if not, I think it's okay to just pass the ball on over to Ingrid, who's going to be presenting on predicting the occurrence of wetlands.
Thanks, Nate, and thank you, Gretchen. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us for day 2. I think Gretchen just touched on some of my talking points in this presentation, so I may be repeating a little bit, but I think that may be helpful because it's a confusing topic, and it doesn't hurt to hear this twice, I think. So we're going to talk about how you can identify wetlands, starting from existing maps and some other sources of information you can use to clue you into unmapped wetlands. In particular, I'll focus on soil maps and air photos. So I'll provide an overview of these existing wetland maps, the National Wetland Inventory and DEC's New York State Freshwater Wetlands Map, which Gretchen just described. And then I'll talk about some sources of information, in particular the soil drainage classification and hydric status of soils, and the use of natural color and color infrared air photos, how you can access this information through some different online mapping tools. And this will hopefully tee up everything for Gretchen's next presentation about the use of topographic maps for wetland identification and putting this all together, where you will practice applying this method to mapping wetlands remotely on site. So throughout the presentation, I'll refer to the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper, which is an interactive online mapping tool from the Hudson River Estuary program. It's available through the EC website, and in addition to wetlands, it shows a lot of other information about important habitats and water resources. Hopefully check it out if you're not yet familiar with it. A lot of the data I'll discuss here are available through the Natural Resource Mapper, makes it, I think, much easier to apply this method than it may have been in the past. So I'm not going to go into detail, though, about the details of kind of how the mapper works and what you need to click. We do have a recorded webinar on the landing page, along with an instructions document for how to use mapper. And you can always reach out to me if you run into any issues. Okay, so I was talking about the National Wetland Inventory, and I'll just move along. So the NWI classifies wetlands according to a scheme that incorporates water regime, which is, the duration and frequency of standing water or saturation, vegetation cover, and variables. And nowadays, the wetlands are each assigned a code that relates to the particular wetland habitat type. Nowadays, this information is classified for you very readily in these mappers by general habitat type. And basically this allows you to distinguish the forested wetlands from the open, kind of more herbaceous emergent wetlands, or if you're in a coastal area, the estuarine wetlands. And as well, it'll separate out riverine wetlands and lakes and ponds and things like that. So next up, Gretchen talked about DEC's wetland maps. These are also referred to as the New York State freshwater wetlands. And as she said, they have an important function determining the state's jurisdiction over wetlands under Article 24 of Environmental Protection Law. In general, these only show wetlands that are 12.4 acres or larger. The rare exception of wetlands that have been deemed of unusual local importance. A lot of this mapping was completed based on air photos that dated back to the early 1980s, and as a result, the wetland boundaries on these maps are not highly accurate. So this is a kind of what that looks like on the left, the older maps and the new digital data. And for that reason, the online version of these maps shows this wide wetland check zone. Sorry, I'm going to go back into presentation mode again here. And in the case where a project is proposed in one of these areas, DEC will send out a wetland biologist to determine where that jurisdictional boundary is, along with the boundary of the 100-foot adjacent area that is also regulated. So this is just a comparison of the NWI and the DEC maps for that same area. And you can see the DEC map on the right omits many of wetlands shown in NWI, and the boundaries are fairly different. So the NWI shows many more wetlands than the DEC map. A closer look at this area based on Hudsonia's high-resolution habitat mapping, and they do a lot of field verification and checking of this map, shows that there are many more wetlands in this area than are mapped on either NWI or DEC. The boundaries are different, and some wetlands are missing altogether on both of the latter map, the former map. Before I move on to talking about how you can use additional mapping information to identify where those missing wetlands might be, and to accurately map the boundaries of those wetlands. I just want to note that that DEC also has maps of tidal wetlands available, and on the Hudson Valley Natural Resource Mapper you can access tidal wetland maps for the Hudson Valley along the Hudson River. These date back to 2007. They're pretty accurate still nonetheless. And there also are regulatory maps of tidal wetlands, but those are restricted to marine areas south of the Tappan Zee Bridge and on the left. County soil survey maps are another really good source of information for predicting wetlands. In particular, we recommend looking at the soil drainage classification. For wetland identification, we're generally looking at these bottom three classes. Let's see. So these are the kind of ranging from somewhat poorly to very poorly drained soils. Poorly and very poorly drained soils largely correspond to the hydric soil classification, which commonly is referred to as wetland soils. But you'll also often find mapped wetlands in the somewhat poorly drained soils, even when they're not classified as hydric. In the natural resource map, we've extracted this information from the county soil surveys and displayed them as possible and probable wetland areas. And you can click on the map and pull up detailed information about the individual soil units. So these are shown here on the left, along with the DEC and NWI mapped wetlands. And you can see that there's a much greater area covered by soil units than by the NWI and DEC wetlands. That doesn't mean that the entire soil unit here is a wetland. By all means, it's most likely not. It simply means these are good areas to flag, to check for additional wetlands, and to check the boundaries of mapped wetlands. Keep in mind that the soil in this county soil surveys are typically only mapped to an accuracy of about 2 acres, and there can be inclusions of other soil types within a soil unit. They're not always homogeneous. So with that in mind, these are a really good starting point for remote identification of wetlands. Believe it or not, when we started this training back 20 years ago, our colleagues were teaching folks like you how to use stereoscopic air photo, which allow you to view the imagery in 3 dimensions, and that's still used by some specialists. But fortunately for you, we now have very readily accessible online digital ortho imagery available from New York State for the 6-inch to 1-foot resolution, 3 to 4 years. And these air photos are referred to as ortho imagery, which means images have been digitally manipulated or ortho-rectified to remove distortion from camera tilt and the relief of the terrain, and create a uniform scale so that you can overlay these images with other mapped information. Most people nowadays are used to looking at air photos through services like Google Maps and Google Earth. These typically show imagery taken during the growing season in true color, which is kind of what you see with your naked eye, leaf on. So this kind of in the left here. Many people prefer green, lush landscape images, but if you're trying to identify wetlands, you really want to look at the leaf off imagery so you can see what's going on underneath the tree. And that's shown kind of in the middle here, the same site. And on the right-hand side, for those of you who have access to GIS software, perhaps, and I'll tell you about another program or website you can use, color infrared imagery will in fact show the greatest amount of contrast in the air photos, and is really the best for looking at wetlands and other surface water features like small streams. Color infrared photos are taken by recording both the visible light spectrum as well as near infrared light, which is invisible to our eye. The infrared spectrum is then displayed in red, and since it picks reflectance from photosynthetic activity. Anything in these photos that is appears bright red is likely some kind of actively growing plant or tree. So these areas here look like lawns or fields that are growing. These reddish things are probably conifer trees. And I'll go through a few more examples. So just to compare these different types of photos, the snack sequence shows an area in Maury Mill State Park in Dutchess County. So this is a color leaf-on image. The forest looks like a sea of green. It's very beautiful, but you can't really see on underneath those trees. Versus over here, this is a true color leaf-off image taken before the trees have leafed out, and you can a lot of these little dark areas in this cover, and many of these are in fact small wetlands. And lastly, this is a color infrared image of the same location, and kind of the water just stands out even more starkly, I think, here against the background, and the red areas and kind of pinkish things are growing vegetation. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to really focus on signatures of true color imagery, which is what's most really accessible to people using the Natural Resource Mapper and through other online mapping services. So this is a summary of some of those key signatures for wetland vegetation. And so if you're looking at an image and you see kind of dark areas in the photo that are topographic basins, which Gretchen will talk more about next, or that are located on those poorly drained soils, that's a good indication you might be looking at a wetland. If you see a flat black or navy blue area, it's probably open water. Dark area that is located, it's kind of textured. You can see the tree trunks visible like matchsticks. That might be a swamp with the trees standing in it. Small dark spots, dark pools in the forest could be possible woodland pools or vernal pool. And if you're looking in an area that has kind of white speckled vegetation with open water, that could be a marsh. I'm going to show you what these things look like. This is so you have a written summary. And lastly, if you're seeing kind of white mottled vegetation that's probably herbaceous, no trees, that could be a wet meadow. Bottom line is, I don't expect you to remember all of these details in this one brief presentation. A good idea if you're trying to learn how to read these air photos is to a location that you're familiar with, where you know there are a variety of different wetland types that you can see in the field, and then to compare to what it looks like in an air photo using the Natural Resource Mapper or another website. And then that way you can become more familiar with a site that you already know and how it looks from the air. So I'll share a few examples. This is an example. We're looking at a mostly forested area that has kind of this brown texture. I always think that the trees kind of look like little matchsticks, diagonal matchsticks. And there are lots of little dark areas in here. So this area, this flattish area is forest. The small little shadows are they're larger than a shadow. That's probably a woodland pool. These areas here, you can kind of see the darker background. There looks like there's some saturation or standing water, probably a hardwood swamp. This black flat area is probably a pond or a lake. Open water. How am I doing on time? I know I lost.
I think you should be able to still be, you're kind of at time, but if you want to wrap it up in the next few minutes.
I'll run through just one more example here. I'm just showing the edge of a lake that's grading into a marsh. It's kind of white speckled vegetation with a blackish background. It's a good indication of marsh. And it may be hard to see, but as you look kind of going toward the edge here, you see more of a texture, and those are trees, and this is a swamp. So it's grading from open water to marsh to swamp versus up here in the upper right corner, the lighter background, brown background, that's an upland hardwood forest. And kind of the same thing here, you see a swamp there, this is a pond and so forth. Here we're looking at a floodplain with a stream running through it, and these are kind of this white blotchy vegetation. This is a wet meadow surrounding a stream. Here it's probably marsh, it's darker, that's an indication of standing water and so forth. This is probably a swamp up here. It's hard to tell where the wetland ends, and this is just a good reminder that you probably need to go out in the field. You should be going out in the field, or a qualified professional should be going out to verify wetland boundaries. You can use the Natural Resource Mapper to pull up this information and print out field sheets for yourself if you're going on a site visit. To check whether there may be additional wetlands. You don't, again, need to be the person that is determining where these boundaries are, but if you think there are indicators present, then you should be making a recommendation for a wetland delineator to go out. This is the same area. I'm just pointing out that you can use the Natural Resource Mapper to print a map with the parcel boundaries and aerial imagery. Discover.gis Data NY is a website that has the state's ortho imagery going back to 1994. And I'll note that you can access color infrared aerials through this website for the older imagery. And I recommend looking at 2001, and this is what it looks like. So these are, of course, images that are 20 years old, but in many cases they can still be helpful. Compare this imagery with the more recent imagery for your area. Different dates of imagery are listed on the right-hand side of the screen. And we'll be talking next about using topographic maps, and I also just want to point out that you can access USGS topographic maps through the national map, which is an online map. It's available through base map options, and it may be available through other online maps available to you, like through a county, for example. All right, so I'm sorry for my audio problems, but I hope that provided a helpful overview, and Gretchen will help you put it all together so you can practice applying this technique. Thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Ingrid. I think we can all empathize with having a poor internet connection and not being able to access internet from work. So yeah, I guess from here, Gretchen will take over. So you can unmute yourself, Gretchen, and continue. Are you having a hard time unmuting, Gretchen?
Can you see that?
Yep,
Good.
We're all set.
Good. So, can you hear me? Yes. This is more of a hands-on segment of the webinar in which we'll demonstrate how to find many of the unmapped wetlands using topographic maps and give you a chance to practice these techniques, which can be very valuable when you're looking at topographic maps that might be part of site plans or other site maps where you are reviewing projects or considering new new land uses. Many of you, I'm sure, are accustomed to using USGS topographic maps for hiking and orienteering and maybe for other purposes. And you may be also accustomed to seeing elevation contours on site plans and subdivision plats and other drawings depicting the sites of proposed land development projects, or say lands for public recreational uses. But you may not have used the topography for finding unmapped wetlands, because the contour lines indicate many aspects of the terrain, places that are higher and lower in the landscape, aspect, steep slopes, gentle slopes, flat areas, benches, swales, and basins. You can use the contours to predict where water is likely to collect and flow, even where ponds, wetlands, and streams have not been explicitly mapped. Each contour line indicates points of equal elevation, and neighboring contour lines are spaced at a standard elevational distance on each map. On a site plan, the contour interval is often 2 feet, as on this map. On a USGS topographic map in the 7.5-minute series, the contour interval will be 10 feet or 3 meters in much of the landscape, but 20 feet or 6 meters on quadrangles where there's a lot of steep terrain. Typically, a few of the contour lines are labeled with the actual elevation above sea level. This line, for example, is at 960 feet above sea level, and this one is at 950 feet. Thus, if you're moving from west to east between those two labeled lines, you'd be moving downhill. Remember that each contour line indicates points of equal observation on this site map. So if you're walking along a path along this contour line, you'd be at a constant elevation of 960 feet above sea level. This map does have 2-foot contour intervals, so if you turn right and walk down to the neighboring contour line and follow it south, then you'd be walking at a constant elevation of 958 feet on a hillside 2 feet below the first line. On all maps with elevation contour lines, steeper slopes are indicated where the contours are closer together, and gentler slopes or flat areas are indicated where the contour lines are farther apart. So here in the upper right is an area of steep slopes that I've circled in orange. And here's another area over on the right. And over here on the left is an area of gentler slopes where the contour lines are far apart, where I've circled in green. And here's another area. So this is an aerial view of a fairly dramatic forested landscape. There's a road running north to south through the center of the image with a few fields near the road. And the road appears to be flanked by hills that rise steeply on each side. In some places, just by the shadows, you can detect where there are steep slopes and swales and ravines. Here's a USGS topographic maps section of the same area. In this close-up of the topographic map, several streams are mapped with blue lines. Notice the shape of the contour lines in the vicinities of those streams. The streams all occur in places where there are these series of V-shaped contours with the V's pointing upslope. That is the basic signature of a stream on a topographic map. Here the streams happen to be mapped, but on other map sections, that same configuration of contour lines can lead you to streams that have not been mapped. Here's an example from a different USGS topographic segment. To find unmapped streams, first you need to figure out which areas are higher and which areas lower on the map. We can see from a couple of labeled elevations that the land is high in the northwest quadrant at 550 feet and higher, and lower to the south and southeast, there's a contour labeled 400 feet. Finding those few labeled contour lines is often the quickest way to tell what is high and what is low on your map. In the southern part of the map, there is one mapped stream shown as a blue line on the lower part of this hillside, but from the contour lines elsewhere, I guess that there are several unmapped streams in this map segment. Starting in the northeast corner at the upper right, I predict a stream right here. I'm drawing it in green in the upper right. And another one right here. You see that I'm drawing the stream through this series of V-shaped contour lines, the V's pointing uphill. And another stream here running into this depression, which is probably an unmapped pond. At the southern stream that was already mapped in blue, see that the V-shaped contour lines continue farther up the hill. So I'm guessing that the stream actually starts way up here. Topographic maps explicitly show a few things, but there are a lot of things that you can determine from them implicitly. They show elevations, just like on the maps I've been showing you. They show some cultural features. They show a few wetlands, but only a few. There are some contour, some elevation figures. Wetlands are shown by this grassy symbol that you see on lots of other kinds of maps. Most wetlands are not shown at all on the USGS topographic maps. So how do you find potential wet areas? This map shows 4 knolls. I'm drawing arrows to the high points. And we see this broad basin between the knolls. The V-shaped contour lines indicate a stream here draining into the basin, and another one here draining out of the basin. This is really a perfect place to find a wetland, even though this map doesn't have a wetland symbol here and no wetlands appear on other wetland maps. So I would go right there and expect to find some kind of wetland. It might not cover that whole area, but I would bet that there are some wetland areas within that basin. Wetlands do sometimes occur on hillside slopes, but the most obvious places to look for wetlands are in basins, on floodplains, on hillside benches, and in other flattish areas where water is likely to collect. So look for places where the contour lines are fairly far apart, indicating level or gently sloped terrain. These places can be small. They can be on hillsides. They can really be anywhere. On this map, I would predict that we might find wetlands here, where I'm putting these stars, and there, and quite a few other places. This shows a stream flowing east to west, right to left. And these arrows show the areas where the contour lines are widely spaced along the stream, indicating the broad, flattish areas of the stream's floodplain. This is another kind of area where you might find wetlands. Floodplains often hold both wetland and non-wetland habitats. One more topographic signature for you to know. Wherever you see what looks like lots of little unmapped streams close together, this is likely to be a seepy hillside. Probably many seeps and springs feeding these crowded little streams. The contour lines have this kind of scalloped appearance. Seeps that flow long enough to support hydrophytic vegetation are wetlands. So this kind of place would be worth checking out with a field visit to see if this is a seepy hillside, and if much of that area actually is wetland. So this is another topographic map, and we'd like you to use this to practice on. This is one of the maps that we sent you by email and by ground mail to those of you who asked for it, and we hope that most of you have a printed version of this map in front of you. I asked you to print it in color because that's the way that you can detect the mapped streams from the contour lines. We'd like you to find and draw all of the unmapped wetlands that you can find on this map. And the first thing you'd want to do is figure out which places are high and which are low in different parts of the map. There are a few labeled contour lines that will give you some clues. Also, remember that the land rises on either side of the mapped streams or their floodplains. Down in the bottom left, you see the stream. It's labeled Stony Kill. It runs along the whole bottom. There's a broad, flattish area along the stream, and then the land rises up from that stream. It might help if you find the places with V-shaped contour lines with the V's pointing uphill, because that sometimes helps you to locate streams. There are other places where the V's point down hills. Those are not streams. So I want to, so on this map, I've exaggerated the streams that are already mapped. And there are a few more streams that are actually quite a few more streams that you could find here. There are a few, and in fact, I found many. This is not an exercise in mapping streams. I just want you to be aware that that is another thing you could detect from this topographic map. But what I'd like you to do is to map wetlands. So here, just to get you started, there is one that I would map. There is another. There is another, and there are many more. I think I found something like 16 total potential wetland areas here. I believe there are probably more. I haven't spent a lot of time with this. So what I'd like to do is have everyone take about 5 minutes. Don't disconnect from us, but just work on your own. Mark up the map that's in front of you with all the places that you think could be streams. Those could be low or high places. They could be on hillsides, like little benches, little shoulders. They could be little basins between knolls. We'll come back together. And my watch is not right, but if we come back together around 10 after 4, would that be right?
Yep, that could work.
And we'll see what we found.
All right, Gretchen, it looks like we're at 10 after now.
Okay, so let's see, am I muted? No. So if we could have everyone's attention back here. I'll show you the wetlands that I had mapped, and then I'd like to know if any of you had problems with this exercise or questions about how to do this.
Yes, feel free to comment in the chat. And if you do see a wetland that we haven't mapped, try to describe it, and we'll see if we can validate you. All right, Gretchen, we're not getting anything in the chat, so
Okay.
Oh, we have one thing. The wetland you have around the little circle in the upper left middle, I thought that was the top of the hill. Maybe I'm reading it wrong.
No, you are reading that probably. Well, actually, let me go back to the what we have here is several knoll tops. All of these little circles are little high areas. There. I drew a wetland here, not because I really wanted to include that little high area, but really because I wanted to include all the low area around it. So I would agree, and you would be correct, that little spot there, if that's the one you're referring to, would be high, and it would be, in this case, 10 feet higher, presumably, or could be as much as 10 feet higher than the rest of this. But this area around that, I'm guessing, could have wetland in it. And I say that simply because this area around it is a basin between knolls, and that's often where you find water collecting.
All right, we have another question. Since all the black rectangles are homes, would it make sense that the large bottom swamp is instead smaller groups of swamps?
Yes, I drew my thing around, so that it didn't include those houses, but you are right. I think we can assume that at least when those houses were built, they were not in wetland, and they're probably still not in wetland. But the point here is that any place within this floodplain area could have wetlands. That is not to say that the entire floodplain is likely to be wetland, because it probably isn't. But it would be worth checking out if this were an area of concern to you.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. How do you determine where the extent of the wetland is via the topography? The drawn wetlands don't necessarily seem to follow contour lines.
Yeah, that's a good question, and these are very, very roughly drawn. There are and I could have drawn these in quite a few other kinds of configurations. So for example, if you can see my cursor, this little wetland here to the left of where it says Colane, I'm guessing there is a wetland here because a stream drains down this way to the west, and a stream drains down that way to the right, and chances are it's draining something wet up here. But this could extend all along this little shoulder of the hillside. I could have drawn this all along there. And if you had done that, I would say, good, that's just as good a guess as this little area that I drew. So don't take this drawing too literally. And if I were to approach this again, I might draw these somewhat differently. But the point is to learn to recognize any of these areas that could hold wetlands and that would be worth checking out in the field.
Great. Thank you, Gretchen. All right, so I think from there we can move on to the next exercise.
Okay. So the next exercise is much the same, but this is a different topographic map. This is a map of the topography in the Millbrook Preserve in the village of New Paltz. That will answer your question, Kathy, that you sent in an email. It's in the village. You can get to the Millbrook Preserve from a trail at the north end of North Mannheim if you're looking for it. We'd like you to use the same kind of analysis to find the places where unmapped wetlands might occur. For this site, you also have a map that I sent you showing a wetland area that shows up on the National Wetland Inventory map. That area is in this broad flat area along the stream shown here. And it also shows areas where the soils map indicates places with probable or possible wetlands. Those are the areas where the mapped soils are poorly or very poorly drained, which are the probable wetlands, or the somewhat poorly drained, which are the possible wetlands, as Ingrid described. So you have that one map that shows the NWI wetland shown on the NWI map, along with the possible and probable areas indicated by the soils. You also have an aerial photo of this area, and sometimes you can pick out streams on an aerial or wetlands on an aerial photo. Use all of those things and your knowledge of how to interpret topographic lines to do the same thing on this map. And first, as always, you need to figure out what is high and what is low. There are those maps. You can use them together. Remember that streams are lower than the areas immediately adjacent to them. So you can assume that this broad flat area along these streams is lower than the slopes that rise on either side. That's one clue to what areas are lower and higher. And if you just follow those contours, keeping that in mind, and if you find other streams that are not mapped, you can use that same technique to figure out what areas are low, which would be the streams, and what areas are higher, which would be the slopes adjacent to the streams. So I've begun to map a couple of areas here just to get you started. This place that I just delineated in the upper right, there are several contours in here, so this is sloping upward, but it looks like there might be streams coming down from the northeast and from the east-southeast through this area. My guess is that you could have wetlands all through here, even though there's a considerable elevation through here too. It's just the very broad contours make me think that this could be wet. So I'd like you to spend another 5 minutes if we have that. I think we do.
Yeah, we can do 5 minutes.
To work on this map and delineate the wetlands just as you did on the other map. Okay, so this map shows the wetlands that I found, or the potential wetland areas that I delineated. I am sure there are more, even as I now look at this. There are a few more areas that I would. I did not bother to delineate the large floodplain areas along the streams because those are largely already mapped on the NWI map. I was really looking for the places that are unmapped.
Again, if people have any questions or comments to this map, you can respond in the chat or try to flag me down. Raise your hand if you have your video on.